Hi, Will Henry here. Welcome back to the workshop where, once again, I'm eschewing any paying work and just doing some stuff for myself. Well, what am I doing for myself, you might ask? Well, as you recall, I had bought back my old bench rest rifle, the Wichita Mini, and so I wanted to set back the barrel that was on it, and then I had another barrel that was off a 40X Remington that I'm going to set back as well, and I'll fit these two barrels to that action, and those will be practice barrels, and so that when I get around to putting a new barrel on it, hopefully my shooting will be good enough to know whether it works or not. So to that end, I took the time to make myself an action wrench for the Mini. There it is, and so I could pull the barrel off it. Now, when I put that barrel on 40 years ago, I didn't torque it up all that tight. Probably, I would say maybe 60 foot-pounds or something like that. But I'm here to tell you, when it come to taking it off, it took everything I could pull on my 2-foot flex handle to break that loose. So either I've gotten a lot weaker in the intervening 40 years, or the thing tightened up over time, and I like to think the latter. Anyway, so what I was going to show today was I've talked about how when I'm setting back a barrel especially, I'll dial in at the throat, and then I'll bore the start on the taper of the cartridge in order to give the reamer a good straight start, and so that the chamber I cut in the setback will hopefully be straight and perfectly concentric. So now I've already done that, but I thought I would show you a couple of ways that you can check your taper and set up to a taper. Now, of course, the compound feed on the lathe has a scale marked in degrees so that you know roughly how many degrees you have it set at. So you'll set it at 29.5 perhaps to cut threads, or 30 depending on how you feel about that. But in a case like this, the amount of taper is so minuscule that you couldn't see the difference on that scale. So in order to set up the taper, we'll set it up using a dial gauge instead. And so here I'm going to turn you to where you're looking at the machine here. Get you up a little closer. There we go. Now, to get the amount of taper that you want to cut, you can go about it a couple of different ways. One way is to simply take a fired case and measure just ahead of the extractor groove, and then go up an inch from there and measure that. And if I do that, it tells me that there's a taper of approximately 10/1000ths of an inch per inch on that case. Now, the other way to do it is to use a reference book instead, and there's the 6mm PPC drawing with the 262 neck, which is what I'm going to be cutting, and go by the dimensions here. And as you can see here, he shows a body taper per inch of 0.105, and now it says taper per inch, but that's actually the amount of taper in 20 inches. So that's important to note that. So in order to find out the taper per inch, I'm just going to set this aside. We'll just calculate input 0.105 and divide that by 20. which gives us 5/1000ths of an inch of taper. But we know that's not correct either, because we just measured the case, and there's actually 10/1000ths. So what he's actually giving us here is the amount of offset, or the amount of taper you set up in the machine to give you 10/1000ths of taper. So it's important to note that whenever you're using a reference book, kind of work backwards and make sure that that he's telling you what you want to know. Anyway, so what we want to know is we want to taper about 5/1000ths of an inch. Now, when I do this, I actually will generally set it up to taper a little more than the 5/1000ths of an inch. I'd maybe taper 6/1000ths. And the reason for that is that the last thing I want is to have the shoulder of the chamber too big, so that the reamer won't clean it up. I generally start out having a couple thousandths for the reamer to clean up at the base, and at the other end it ends up having to clean up 3. That doesn't bother me, and it's a lot better than not having it clean up at all. And you can ask me how I know that, but never mind. Anyway, so like I say, I've already done that, but let me show you. In this particular case, we, like I say, I wanted to have a little over 5, and in fact I thought 6 was fine, so I set everything to 0. The dial gauge is, whoops, okay, there we go. It's at 0, and I've got it running just on the side of the chuck. And I've checked this, and the side of the chuck is pretty parallel to the ways. It's not out by more than about 1/4 thousandth, and in the scheme of things, that's okay. Now, so I set up the dial to run on the side of the chuck, and I set my angle on the compound, and then I just run the compound ahead 1 inch, and 2, 3, 8. Okay, run it ahead 1 inch, and so it shows 6/1000ths of an inch of taper, which is just fine with me. And now, before you do that, one thing you want to be sure of is you want to make sure everything's tightened down well, and you want to make sure your jibs are tight on your slide, because otherwise there's a little slop in there, maybe only a couple thousandths of an inch, and it's kind of nice because it's easier to crank, but you can have some error that way, and since we're working pretty close here, we don't want that error. So anyway, that's how you do that. Now, an alternative way to do it is to set up a dial gauge against the carriage and take this dial and run it on the compound, on the side of the compound, and you move your carriage 1 inch, and see what reading you get on the side of the compound. Either way works. I kind of think that doing it this way is more valid, providing the surface you're indicating against is parallel. I think this is a little more valid because you're going to have the tail or the carriage locked in place, and you're going to be feeding strictly with your compound. So that's the information you want, is how much angle you've got set at the compound. Anyway, so like I say, I've already done this, and it's been bored. And now what I'll do is turn down the tenon, and but I'm not going to thread it. I'm going to turn it down to 1 inch, and which is the tenon for the Wichita is 1 inch by 16 threads per inch, and it's roughly 7/8 of an inch long. And so anyway, I'll turn this down to 1 inch and have it machined to the size I want on the outside, but I won't thread it, and I'll chamber it, and then I'll thread it afterwards. And the reason I do that is because then I can set the barrel up between centers and thread it, and I can take it out from between centers and check it in the action, which is glued into the stock. I can't screw that action on and check it, so so I do it this way instead, between centers. Now, I could just duplicate the thread on the barrel that came out of here, but you know what? When I did that 40 years ago, I think I made it just a little looser than it had to be, and so I'm planning on making the pitch diameter about 1/1000th or 1/1000th and a half bigger on this, and I kind of want to be able to check and just make sure I haven't gone too far, because the one that I say was a little bit loose isn't super loose. It's just I just thought I could do a little better this time around, and you know, I must have learned something in 40 years, for crying out loud. Anyway, that's that. And I might set up and show the chambering operations. We've seen that enough. I'll be cutting the throat separately on this one. And in fact, on most of my bench rest rifles, I almost always cut the throat separately. Some people say that that's not good because the throat could then be eccentric to the chamber. Well, if your chamber's eccentric, it's a mess anyway. And to me, if you can set up straight once, if you can cut straight once, you can cut straight twice. And the throater absolutely will follow the bore. And because I bored this and it's as close to concentric as I can make it, it's going to be concentric and in line with the bore too, so everything should be fine. But anyway, so I'll be cutting the throat separately. I think I've shown that before, but I may show it again. Yeah, and that's that. The throater I'll use in this, I have I think I have 3. I have one that's 2430, which worked great for bullets that I was using at that time, which were a little under 243. They were 2427 or some darn thing. And then I have another one that's 2433, which I had to fit bullets that were just a little bigger that I was using, and later on. And then the last one I have is 2435, which is probably what I'll use, because that works with virtually any bullet I'm likely to use in this 6mm PPC. And yeah, so that's that. Anyway, so for now, this is Will Henry, out.